Ladies and gentlemen, dear colleagues, good evening. On behalf of Dr. Stijn Lattre, Director of UXIA, University Center St. Ignatius, Antwerp, and on behalf of my colleagues Gilke Heurt and Annick Willems, I may welcome you all for this theology lecture this evening. It's a nice spring evening here in Antwerp. We hope that we will have a normal public, but it's possible that some of the members of our public will be outside for a walk in the park. We will see. Welcome. We have in UXIA the tradition, a good tradition, to organize some days before Easter each year a theology lecture. This year, due to the pandemic of COVID-19, the lecture has the format of a webinar. And this is yes, a solution, a nice solution we have anyhow. The session is recorded. The recording of this webinar will be made available via the website of UXIA. Participants will receive an email upon publication. You are also most welcome to post your questions for the keynote speaker in the Q&A box, questions and answer box. The chat function is reserved for general remarks. Your microphones are not functioning, your cameras are not functioning. This year we have a very distinguished speaker for this theology lecture. His name is Peter Scott. Professor Dr. Peter Scott is Samuel Ferguson Professor of Applied Theology and Director of the Lincoln Theological Institute at the University of Manchester in the United Kingdom. He is the author of many books, and his teaching and research is to be found at the intersection of political theology and ecological theology. Professor Scott is also a member of the Center of Theological Inquiry at Princeton in the United States of America. His talk this evening is entitled Planetary Ecology and Climate Change. So, Professor Scott, please, you have the digital floor.
Thank you very much, and thank you for the welcome. And it's a delight to be here. I'm speaking to you from Manchester in the United Kingdom, and so my greetings to those of you in Antwerp and wherever you're joining from. I send my greetings. This evening's talk is called Planetary Theology and Climate Change, and the very first thing I want to do is just share my screen, just to show you a couple of slides. Here we are. So this is the title, and I'm going to be talking just briefly about a BBC TV series called A Perfect Planet. So here's a screenshot of it. And as you can see, there are 5 episodes, beginning with volcano, then the sun, weather, oceans, and humans. And part of what I want to say has been kind of provoked by this presentation. And then my last slide is this. It simply gives you a sense of the contents of my talk tonight. So it comes in 5 parts. I'm going to open and close with reference to this BBC TV series. But the core of my presentation is to talk a little bit about the planetary and moving from global context to planetary, and then in relation especially to Balassurier and Spivak's work, and then to talk a little bit about the mandates in Dietrich Bonhoeffer before picking up the theme of the political. So that's what's on the menu, so to speak. Okay, so to my first part then, on see if I can close that down. Yes. So for the first part then on, to talk a little bit about this BBC TV series on nature. It's called A Perfect Planet. It's narrated by David Attenborough, and it was first broadcast in January 2021, January this year. And it was the title that caught my eye. In what sense, I wondered, might this planet be considered perfect? It also may mark a move by the BBC away from programmes on what is often called the natural world, i.e. a focus on animals and plants, and to perhaps towards a more systemic view of planet Earth. And as you've seen, the series comprised 5 programmes covering volcanoes, the sun, weather, oceans, and then last, humans. As has been traditional for many years now, for the flagship nature programmes out of the BBC, it was narrated by David Attenborough. And that's important, I think, because these nature programmes, sometimes presented but more recently narrated by Attenborough, have made a contribution to the public discourse on climate change and other environmental matters here in the UK. The BBC 2017 series, Blue Planet 2, which Attenborough narrated, was widely credited with raising awareness in the UK regarding ocean pollution by plastics. His conversation with Greta Thunberg was, of course, widely reported also. So it seems to me it's of interest as regards the communication of science and climate change that this TV series, A Perfect Planet, should present humans as clearly identified as planetary instigators in some way. But in what way? How are human beings active? How are they integrated into Earth systems? How are they a force within Earth systems? And the content of the 5th programme on humans, I think with a capital H, speaks of powerful natural forces with reference to weather, sunlight, ocean currents, and volcanic activity, and notes that the planet is a fragile system before identifying humans as the most influential creature on Earth and one which, I quote, threatens the future of life on Earth. Indeed, the programme goes on to say that in the previous 5 extinction events, volcanoes are identified as producers, major producers of CO2. And as we confront a possible 6th extinction event, the narration identifies humans as a super volcano. Digging up CO2 leads to warming and then to changing weather patterns. And then the programme speaks of the deep consequences for this perfect planet of ours, or the balance of our perfect planet, or the equilibrium of our world. And this 5th and final programme, called Humans, ends on an encouraging note with reference to reforesting schemes, animal rescue, interviews with young people. We are told, the capacity and the knowledge to reduce our carbon footprint and harness the forces of nature for our energy and protect the natural world. What we do not have is time. In its reference to Earth sciences, the series invites a discussion of the meanings of the planetary in the context of a common home. When we say that we are planetary beings, what do we mean by this? And can the concept of planetary theology help us with this question? So I want to move on to the second part of what I want to say, which is to talk a little bit about what planetary might mean. And I want to pick up on a book by Tisa Balasuria, if I pronounce the name correctly, published in 1984, called Planetary Theology. And that book is influenced by the emergence of contextual and liberation theologies. So we have, to quote directly, this notion of the planetary as the kind of new context in which theology is to be done. Here I quote, "By extension, the whole planet Earth as an entirety must be seen as a context for theology. Today, the destinies of all peoples are closely interrelated and linked to the future of the Earth, the lands, the seas, the atmosphere, and outer space." End quote. So the scope of the term planetary here seems to then to relate to a desire for perhaps a truly universal universalism that is global in extent and identifies the interdependencies with which theology must work. I'll quote one more time. We all live on planet Earth with one limited, interlinked global ocean chain, one atmosphere and one overall weather system. So in this context, in Balasuria's analysis from 1984, planetary seems to identify a universal context and an extended temporal scope, a perspective in which theology is done. We focus upon interdependencies. I think some of this notion of the planetary as a fresh context for which theology is done has been developed a little. I'm thinking here of Heather Eaton's 2017 essay, which she calls an Earth-Centric Theological Framing for Planetary Solidarity. And here planetary seems to refer us to the biosphere. She speaks of an interactive, infinitely dynamic, complex sphere of life. And then she goes on to identify planetary processes like climate systems, hydrologic cycle, ocean currents, and biomass distribution. And like Balasuria, she argues that the planetary takes us beyond political boundaries or nation states, beyond what she calls the standard planetary map. And she argues that perhaps the planetary forces us to think past current political arrangements towards perhaps a global human community. And she focuses upon biosphere, nation states, economic globalization, but it's the biosphere which she regards as being the determining feature. I think this theme of planetary is also present in some theological work, even when the term isn't. So I'm thinking here of Timothy Gorringe's 2011 book treatment, The Common Good and the Global Emergency. And when we ask, well, what is the global emergency? We learn that world population, climate change, and resource depletion are the three crucial features. So it seems to me, although the term planetary is not used, Gorringe's analysis directs us towards the planetary as context. But where I think the notion of planetary is developed a little bit differently in contemporary theology is in the theological reception of Spivak's work. And it's to the theological reception of Gayatri Chakravorty Spivak's work that I want now to turn. Because in the theological reception of Spivak's work, there is agreement, I think, that Spivak is providing us with an account of the planetary that's to be contrasted with the global. The planetary and the global are not the same. So Kwok Bulan, commenting on Spivak's work, argues that globalized neo-colonialism, she puts it, requires a new imaginary for the purposes of critique. And the planetary provides just this. Or as Laurel Schneider puts it, the planetary is a notion that, according to Spivak, stands in opposition to the global. Or Jenna Teitzman, Spivak offers two imaginaries of the earth: globalization, the disembodied everywhere of information networks in which everything is accessible, simultaneous, and subsumed into the imagined same system of exchange; and planetarity, which offers us infinite possibilities for difference. Infinite possibilities for difference. At stake here in this theological reception is some key sentences by Spivak, and I want to quote them directly to offer you Spivak in her own voice. So this is Spivak. I propose the planet to overwrite the globe. Globalization is the imposition of the same system of exchange everywhere. The globe is on our computers. No one lives there. It allows us to think that we can aim to control it. The planet, by contrast, is the species of alterity, belonging to another system, and yet we inhabit it on loan. It is not really amenable to a neat contrast with the globe. I cannot say the planet, on the other hand. When I invoke the planet, I think of the effort required to figure the impossibility of this underived intuition. To be human is to be intended towards the other. We provide for ourselves transcendental figurations of what we think is the origin of this animating gift. Mother, nation, God, nature. These are the names of alterity, some more radical than others. If we imagine ourselves as planetary subjects rather than global agents, planetary creatures rather than global entities, alterity remains underived from us. It is not our dialectical negation. It contains us as much as flings us away. I think then we begin to appreciate that a program of theological work now begins to emerge. Spivak is inviting attention to theological difference. So, how is that difference to be considered? As Kwok summarizes the ethical implications of Spivak's position, a planetary ethic thus calls for the experience of the impossible that is radically open-ended and that is to come. How then should we speak of multiplicity, differentiation, and pluralization, and at the same time communion and relationships? In other words, when the openness of planetary ethics includes an openness to the solar and the galactic, when the forces that govern these spheres are part of the otherness that informs a planetary ethic. So I think here the meaning of the planet is extended from the atomic to the cellular, and then to the solar and the galactic. This is the otherness of the planetary that contains us and flings us away, to which we are never other except in imagination. So they're identified here are forces of attraction and processes of dispersal, of life as entropic and negentropic. As such, we are moved from the epistemological issues of difference towards practical issues of attraction and dispersal, of life's building up and running down in a giddying range of scales, from the subatomic to the astrological. With Kwok and Schneider, we arrive somewhere new, I think. We are invited to affirm a reading of planetarity that affirms differences, but presses us beyond the differences of culture to the differences of bodies, from the subatomic to the galactic. As Imfeld and Losch suggest, we are confronted here not by the topography of the city, with which we might well be familiar, but with the topography of the universe. What is that? These bodies are, of course, forces, processes, and pressures that exceed and yet run through human culture. And I'll talk a bit more about them in just a minute. I think we're taken further than Mark Wallace's comment that all things are persons, he writes. All things are persons, only some of whom are human, because all beings are part of an intersubjective community of relationships, only some of whom are recognizable as living beings by us. Pache Wallace, we're not here in this developing planetary perspective concerned with the personalizing of all beings. We're instead in a more troubling place, where the planetary encompasses a range of scales and a set of forces that might be understood as teleological in some general sense, but impact upon the human in inhuman ways through planetary powers and forces that cannot be rendered personal. So we might say then that the planetary pluralizes, that it requires us to consider a greater multiplicity of bodies, the ways in which human bodies interact with planetary bodies. The humans are with animals part of and entangled in wider planetary processes. And perhaps that allows us to be a little bit more specific now, that planetary life requires some kind of stable surface, I think now there's widespread agreement that life changes its environment and so makes a contribution to its habitat. So that simply reinforces the point, which of course the BBC TV series picks up, that we need to consider the matter of our planetary surface from land to ocean. Yet given the forces that are required to sustain planets in movement, principally gravity and light or energy, we're obliged to a Spivakian-inspired attention to planetary difference to consider important forces operative in the movement of planets, and gravity and light seem especially important here. So the suggestion I'm making, building a little on the theological reception of Spivak's work, is that ethical inquiry must be understood as emerging from and being attentive to planetary bodies, from planets to cells. Ethical inquiry, I guess, must be founded on our status as planetary beings, as agents who are the products of and subject to planetary forces, and whose wants are in some sense planetary. In other words, if we're going to do an ethics of planetary life, this must be a material ethics, an ethics that emerges from the life of human beings as planetary, in which some account of what planetary means contributes to our understanding of ethics. There's an interesting discussion of this point in the work of Raymond Williams, when he asks himself the question, what are these planetary conditions that we might wish to pay attention to? Well, we've been exploring two already, in a sense that the planet is part of a solar system, and therefore gravity and light are vital to its operation. But Williams focuses on other points as well. Our evolved physical organs, he thinks, are also crucial, as well as our genetic inheritance. These are constitutive also of Homo sapiens. These are dimensions, he writes, that are quite beyond us, basic forces, but they've entered so deeply into our ways of living, into our constituted existence, as he writes, that they are conditions of everything we are and do. These are the really basic conditions of life. The question is, how shall we think about them theologically? And of course, how shall we think about them politically, which I'm coming on to in just a moment. So following a hint from Schneider, I've begun to explore the planetary in a more materialist way, an ethic of planetary life as regard for creatures in their liveliness. It will therefore be especially concerned with the planetary margins of life and not just the human margins of life. That is, it may be a preferential ethic, which will be concerned with the edges of life in a geographical sense, to be sure, but also in any place where there are challenges to life. And it may well be, and perhaps we are seeing this already, those challenges may revolve around issues to do with energy and issues to do with water. This is not a simple or straightforward inquiry, I'm sure you'll agree with me, but perhaps we are beginning to discern a different ethical theory that we might call planetary moral law. That is, the human ethical sphere is itself rooted in the planetary, and therefore human ethical thought and human ethical action is deeply informed by and shaped by deep forces that move the planets and out of which human beings have emerged. So we're subject to key needs like water and energy, a stable surface, powers such as light, the attraction of gravity, the dispersal of energy. These are planetary conditions and constraints on ethical thought and action. Such constraints will perhaps be most obvious where the conditions of life are marginal and forced dying edges out life. What turns out to be more important than planetary scale is identifying or acting in those places where the conditions of life are being degraded or ignored. So perhaps here there emerges the bare bones of a preferential ethic of planetary life, life that's subject to the pressures of a planetary emergency, intimately associated with climate change, at the edges of the planet. So that's my section on moving from the planetary as some sort of global context to talk about the planetary in terms of differences, and then to think a little bit about whether, if we move beyond Spivak, as the theological reception of Spivak does indeed move beyond, to say something more than the differences we're dealing with here are cultural differences. They're also planetary in some way differences. We're referred to the key planetary conditions, which are constitutive in some really foundational or basic sense of human living. That's where we've got to now. And now I want to turn a little bit to explore a little bit more the sort of social responsibility or political themes that might emerge from this. And I'm going to do that by turning a little to look at the work of Dietrich Bonhoeffer in relation to the mandates. Excuse me a moment. So as we've seen, in the BBC TV series, A Perfect Planet, the focus is on natural forces and then on the primary natural force of the human. So, and although there is one reference, certainly one reference to human industrial activity, there's very little reference to the political and economic drivers of anthropogenic climate change. Yet the planetary theology that I'm developing in its material aspects and its contrast with globalisation following Spivak and its hints of a preferential ethic, I think suggests that we need to consider these political and economic drivers. And I want to think a little bit about precisely what it means in terms of government and what it means to think about politics. So these are going to be my two themes, government and politics, until almost the very end of what I have to say. So for the next 10 minutes or so, I want to talk about government and politics. Now, Dietrich Bonhoeffer's social ethics of the mandate has been the subject of renewed attention recently in English language discussion of Bonhoeffer's theology, both actually with reference to globalisation and to ecology. So I want to talk a little bit about the mandates now and to ask the question, what might a planetary version of the mandates look like? And if we can think a little bit about what a planetary version of the mandates might look like, can we develop a social ethics of planetary responsibility? Bonhoeffer proposed 4 mandates: work, marriage, sometimes marriage and family, government, and the church. So these are his 4 mandates: work, marriage, government, and the church. His terminology is not always fully consistent, but for the purposes of this presentation, I don't think that matters. In a very interesting essay, Marcus Franz, the essay is called The Conversion of Social Life, Bonhoeffer's Mandates as Theological Dispositives. Franz writes this: with Bonhoeffer, I want to suggest that the mandates are best understood as concrete discursive social practices in which humans encounter the good works of God. This encounter provides a basic social structure in which human beings are set free to live with God and each other. So perhaps we get a sense then of what one reading of what Bonhoeffer is trying to do in these mandates. He's trying to provide social structures which are understood to be God's blessing or God's commandment in some way, and they're about setting human beings free to be with one another and with God. There are 4 of them, and that's really important, because Franz goes on to say, Bonhoeffer also succeeds in further specifying how the commandment retains its critical distance over against immanent social structures. precisely against the theology of orders that would simply identify the existence of a social structure with its being commanded and thus with divine legitimation, as in the German Christian theology. In Bonhoeffer's mandates, the commandment of God retains a superiority over against an extant social life. That is, the commandment of God disposes not only by working within the mandates, but also outside and in between them. Now, we can recall the context in which Bonhoeffer is writing, of course. He's deeply concerned by the way in which certain orders of creation have been taken up and presented as somehow divinely legitimated. And his notion of the mandate is an attempt both on the one hand to affirm certain social structures, and on the other to insist that they don't carry the kind of divine legitimation or the divine affirmation that the orders of creation did. And that's important when France is talking about how the mandates, how the commandment of God works within the mandates, but also outside and in between them. So God retains a kind of reserve, if you like, a reserve in relation to these four mandates. Now, superiority, God's commandment as superior to these mandates suggests a vertical relation, but it seems to me it might be possible to imagine a horizontal relation as well. But perhaps if we can develop a planetary perspective on this, but what we might mean by planetary transcendence or superiority might be about a horizontal distribution of creatureliness that both exceeds humanity and yet engages humanity, and both at the same time. As Spivak notes, the planet contains us as much as it flings us away. So one way of refusing a too immanentist construal of the mandates might be to insist on their planetary otherness, their planetary difference, so to speak, that they are founded in some kind of planetary difference. But such a formulation will only be successful if God's work and God's promise can be articulated with reference to Christ's presence in creation. And in order to do that, we need to give an account, I think, of how the community of creation and participation and engagement with it from a planetary perspective takes people closer to Jesus Christ. Okay, so we have these four mandates. How then should we think again about politics and about government, given this general exposition? In Bonhoeffer's schema of the four mandates, marriage, work, government, church, he actually gives a certain primacy not to government, but to family and work. And he assigns this primacy on scriptural grounds. So he writes at the time, marriage is contracted not by government, but before government. Economic life, science, and art are not cultivated by government itself, but they are subject to its supervision and within certain limits to its control. But at no time does the government become the subject of these spheres of work. So the order of the people is different from the order of marriage and the order of work, and in a sense succeeds them. Government is after marriage and after work. Elsewhere, Bonhoeffer puts the point more bluntly. The divine mandate of government, he writes, already presupposes the mandates of work and marriage. In the world that it rules, government finds already existing these two mandates. So Bonhoeffer goes on to insist that the four mandates are to be understood in relationships of mutual critique. They are with, for, and against each other. They're not simply four just kind of presented to us. They interact, so to speak, with one another. And Bonhoeffer, above all, wishes to avoid the position that one of the mandates is superior to the others, given the wider context in which he's writing, of course, which understood the life of a people as culminating in the Nazi state. We might, in this theological context, given this theological analysis, I guess, developed this line of thought as it calls into question the matter of national government and its activity. That is, should we be concluding that under the pressure of the planetary, attention would move from sovereign government to multi-scale governance? In other words, that governance is informed by a range of stakeholders and across many jurisdictions. Can we speak in any intelligible way about a form of planetary governance? What would planetary governance look like? And of course, that's especially important in this country at the minute, as the UK is the host of COP26, the next conference of the parties meeting, this international gathering of nation states to address matters to do with climate change. So there is a very interesting matter here about whether we could talk about the notion of planetary governance and what might its content be. And that allows me to turn to talk about the political for a few minutes and bring my remarks to a close. Because even if this is persuasive, we could give some content to the notion of planetary governance. It leaves open a very difficult question about what notion of the political emerges. So if we are to speak of planetary governance, what concept of the political is being invoked? There is, in fact, a certain attractiveness in Bonhoeffer's proposal. In calling into question the primacy of government, Bonhoeffer's mandates might allow us to develop his accounts of work and marriage in more planetary directions, that is, to stress the common root of economy and ecology. Perhaps the primacy here should be given to God's oikos as planet, with reference to both production and reproduction. So perhaps at this point it is tempting to assert the importance of the economy and work, for is it not in human industrial and post-industrial activity that we find key drivers of a changing climate? The difficulty with that is, first of all, it would work against Bonhoeffer's commitment, saying, we've got to try and keep the four mandates in play. They interact with one another, so to speak. One is not superior to the other. They're more dynamic and interactive. But it would, of course, leave the notion of government and the political as underspecified. Moreover, when we come to think about the political, has not the current pandemic raised with some force the theme of the political? For have we not seen during this pandemic governments interrupt or interfere with the sort of neoliberal economic governance that is widely practiced now? Nation states, it seems, have indeed asserted themselves. And this does at least seem to raise again the relationship between the political and the economic and the ecological, precisely the planetary. If we connect nation states' responses to the pandemic also to an earlier response by nations to the 2007-2008 financial crash, and where there was a highly significant fiscal intervention by nation states, perhaps we're in a period actually in which the political associated with the actions of the nation states is being presented to us in a really kind of quite forceful kind of way. If that's right, then I think we've been confronted by the question, what is the political condition of planetary governance? What is the political condition of planetary governance? What do we mean by the political if we would talk about planetary governance in this way? Now, to present the matter in this fashion reminds us of Carl Schmitt, of course. And it's true that English language political theology and English language ecological theology has become increasingly interested in Schmitt's concept of politics and its contrastive account of a distinction between friend and enemy. But it seems to me if the planetary theology I'm developing here is right, the problem we face is more an issue of the way of integrating the planetary into the human social, rather than exploring contrastive accounts of the political founded upon notions of friend and enemy. And I think that follows from the dynamic and interactive aspects of Bonhoeffer on the mandates. That if we're going to work with the mandates and God's commandment are present in the form of these mandates in a dynamic and interactive way, indeed, God's commandment being present alongside and within them and beyond them as well, I'm not sure how a notion of the political founded upon a friend-enemy distinction is going to function especially well. Is the invitation rather to follow this line of thought towards an account of politics that reimagines us as planetary beings, but in concrete kinds of ways? So as planetary beings, but beings who are also located in particular places, with particular traditions, and so on. So do we need to find ways of imagining ourselves as different from one another and different from non-human nature, precisely as we understand ourselves as related to each other and being dependent upon nature? Okay, so that brings me to the end of the discussion of the political, and a final couple of minutes just to return to the matter, as promised, of the BBC TV series. So I said I will return to A Perfect Planet, just to make a final comment. And as I hope is evident, I mean, I do welcome this, this development away from focusing upon what the BBC has called programs on the natural world, to look at planetary forces and their relationship to the climate. And this engagement with with Earth system science is, it seems to me, welcome. Whether its presentation of these 5 different forces is helpful, I'm less clear. It seems to offer a picture which is somewhat indebted to an Anthropocene interpretation of our present circumstances. And a widely noted difficulty of thinking with the Anthropocene is whether it doesn't posit human beings as a kind of savior of the planet. And maybe that's there's a trace of that too in the title of the series, A Perfect Planet. What I've been doing is arguing for a different interpretation of planetary, following the theological reception of Spivak, and in turn embracing a planetary materialism. And I've been asking what social ethics of planetary responsibility might follow. And I explored these, with reference to Bonhoeffer's mandates, although I think an adequate account of what we might mean by political is quite hard to discern at the present time. In this presentation, however, I hope to have shown how planetary theology might make a contribution to the public communication of climate change and a possible response regarding a Christian social ethics framed by the mandates. And even if you are unpersuaded by my proposals, I hope to have convinced you that what we mean today by the political is in need of development, and that theology has a contribution to make to that task. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Scott, for this nice talk on planetary theology, of course, and climate change. Thank you very much. I have 2 similar questions. The first question is coming from an anonymous attendee, that person writes, I noticed that Professor Peter Scott relies on an underlying dualism, Homo sapiens versus nature. This implies that man stands above, or less worse, apart from nature. Other examples from within the field of theology, of ecological ethics, that is not human-centered. In other words, is it possible to leave human exceptionalism behind in Christian ecological ethics? And the second question is very similar. So I think, Professor Scott, that you can answer this question, if you please.
Thank you very much. Yes, I mean, I think my opening remarks were framed by the BBC, which I suppose you might kind of understand a kind of dualism operative there, and it's quite an abstract dualism. I suppose is part of the point I was trying to make. You know, we have these four natural forces, beginning with a volcano and ending with oceans, and then the human. And you might say that there is a kind of dualism in that. I think my remarks and this planetary perspective is a way of offering a kind of critique, if you like, of that dualism. So the planetary perspective invites us to wonder where the substantial differences are, and is the substantial difference human exceptionalism viable today? So in my own work, in my own constructive work, I've tried to move away from the kind of a personalist language associated with human being that funds a kind of quite a strong distinction between the human being and the rest of this dynamic order in which we find ourselves, and develop more social metaphors. Indeed, I've been thinking about certain ways of thinking about the non-human can also be done in social metaphors. Yes, so I'm talking about kind of plural social orders interacting with one another, some of which are kind of peopled and produced by humans, and others are not. Yeah, so that's my way, if you like, of trying to address and reduce the dualism. So it's a critique, certainly, of my position is certainly a critique of metaphysical anthropocentrism, and I like to think that perspective means that we can rethink moral anthropocentrism. Not that there won't be occasions in which human beings and the interests of other creatures are irreconcilable, but that isn't the basic position from which we start. I hope that kind of makes some sort of sense. So I'm deeply sympathetic to where your question is coming from, and I've been trying to develop a kind of a suite of metaphors rooted in the notion of society, and this is a creaturely society in which humans and others. So you've got to think that society is not only a human affair, a human constructed affair. And develop an anti-dualistic account and a non-human exceptionist account in that kind of way. It also needs some sort of Christological treatment and so on. But I hope that at least is the start of an answer to your question.
Thank you very much. I have another question. Professor Scott, you used the term Anthropocene. Should we continue doing this in view of, first of all, not scientifically recognized by the ICS, not geological, but cultural change? And secondly, is this not a recognition of a specific kind of exploitation and therefore not neutral? That was the question.
Sure, yes. Very interesting questions. I mean, I think the issue about its scientific status is really interesting. But I think the problem with it is it has been taken up by what we in the UK call environmental humanities. So the environmental humanities has taken up this this term. I mean, the collection obviously between anthropos and human, is clear, and you can see why the environmental humanities might find it attractive. So I suppose I'm less concerned whether it has a scientific status. Indeed, it may well be that it's attracting this kind of interest and this kind of intellectual energy for reasons that are cultural rather than scientific, if I may be allowed that distinction. So I think it's because it's raising certain kinds of issues, which is what I think pointed to in your second question about neutrality. No, precisely, it isn't a neutral notion, and I think some theologians have found it indigestible, precisely because it's not neutral, and it seems to pick up certain, in some of its formulations, certain kind of soteriological themes and redeploy those. And it invites an account of the human. It's as if the planet is a kind of spaceship, and human beings in the Anthropocene are kind of going to steer the spaceship. All this strikes me as being dubious. But my point really was in relation to the BBC TV series, whether there isn't some sort of leakage from this discussion about the Anthropocene into the way the material in the TV series is presented. That was my point, I think.
Thank you very much. Next question from Jan Stel. How would another intelligent species, such as an octopus, think about this superhuman view? Yeah.
Well, yes, that's a profoundly hypothetical question. Yes, isn't there a line from Wittgenstein about if a lion could speak, we would not understand the lion? I think the point of my remarks was that, if you like, the perspective of the octopus, or the place of the octopus in this planetary, is included, so to speak. That if we are going to talk about differences, in that regard, they're not about creating differences in relation to the exclusion of other creatures. So I suppose this goes back to the exceptionalist comment that was part of the first question. Do you see what I mean? So really, the planetary perspective is a question for us. It's a question for human creatures, and I think that's kind of where the challenge is. If our societies are already peopled, are already populated by a huge range of creatures, not only humans, can we find some way of acknowledging that? I think that's the point I'm trying to make.
Thank you. Professor Scott, our participant Henriksen is thanking you for a thought-provoking lecture. Would you mind, is a question, would you mind elaborating further your notion of materialistic ethics with emphasis on materialistic?
Sure, yes. I don't know how it is for you, but in English language discussion, but the term materialism is a bit of a problem, because materialism has been associated with a view that the only thing there is stuff. That there is only a kind of quite reductive notion of matter, but I don't think that's the only way in which we need to think about. Which we can think about materialism. So I think materialism is neutral in relation to whether matter has a divine source or not. So to talk about a materialist ethics is not to exclude a theological view of matter. Indeed, that's precisely what I would like to argue for. But then it is a materialism in another sense, that it's about a kind of dynamic interaction between human beings and the surfaces in which human beings live. Yeah, so I think that I think was another problem with the BBC TV series. You know, it gives you 4 natural forces and then says, and the 5th one is human beings. But the crucial thing is we need to know how human beings do their social and economic and cultural activity relate to the other forces. I think so. That's part of what I mean also by materialism. So I think theology should not be, materialism is not necessarily atheistic. That's point one. And the second point I think I want to make is something about the kind of dynamic interaction between human beings and our environments.
Thank you. The next question is rather a suggestion than a question. Considering the challenges posed to politics, humans, wouldn't the theological concept of stewardship offer a more direct and pragmatic way to deal with ecological challenges? That's a question.
Right, very interesting. Yes, thank you. Again, I just to pick up the neutrality point, I think stewardship is one of those terms that isn't neutral. And so you've kind of got to explore within it what notion of the human is operative there. And, you know, I suspect that too often the notion of steward is a kind of reworking of the dominion language. And then it becomes important to work out kind of what is the anthropology in which the discourse of stewardship operates. And so my caution about the stewardship language is it tends to operate within an anthropology in which there is a kind of binary between humanity and nature. There are some contributions that suggest that you know would resist that, and so Douglas John Hall's work, for example, tries to make the case that it should be about human beings alongside nature and not human beings over nature. But clearly there's some kind of judgment to be made there as to whether, if our problem is our sense of distance from our environment, if that's our problem, whether stewardship, despite its best efforts, repeats that or reinscribes that in some way.
Okay, thank you. And then we have the last question. In Professor Scott's discussion of the definition of the planetary, I was somewhat reminded of the way Schleiermacher discusses the intuition of the universe in the speeches, as well as how he sees, in the speeches at least, religion as a sense and taste of the infinite. These terms move us into materiality in unique ways. Thus, is part of your argument that the planetary suggests aesthetics and affective entanglements as forms of the political?
Well, that's a really
yes, it's a serious question.
Yes, aesthetics as entanglement as a form of the political. Yeah, I mean, I don't know the meaning you intend with all those words, and you know we can't kind of quite have enough of a conversation to draw that out. But that's a really interesting idea. It's, yes, in the sense if you mean that somehow the planetary is present through all our entanglements and therefore also in our political arrangements. Yes, I mean that's really why that's why I'm interested in the distinction between politics and the political that I was making, because I'm trying to find some way, you're right, of getting the sense of the infinite, which would be the planetary in one kind of way, or if not the infinite, the kind of transcendent, the otherness, the ecological transcendence in which we're placed. how is that to be understood as a kind of condition of the political lives that we lead? So yes, I'm agreeing with you, and that's a kind of really. I'm just hesitating at infinite, I think, but I need to talk to you a bit more about that to kind of work out precisely where we agree and where we don't. But thank you for that.
Okay, so then this is the end of this evening. Professor Scott, thank you very much for this very clear and extremely interesting talk. It was a very nice theological lecture. Thank you very much. Thank you also to you, dear participants. It was not possible to have direct contacts with each other, but we're very glad you were here with us this evening. Thank you also to my colleagues, Annick Willems and Hilke Gunst, for their support. I wish you all very nice Easter days, and if you take some Easter holidays, have a nice holiday. Thank you very much. See you later again. Have a nice evening.